Hi everyone, it's Andrea Walford here for SimonsSaysStamp.com. Today I'm going to show you how I created this card using the Simon Says Stamp Home for the Holidays stamp set and coordinating dies. So I'm starting by stamping the two trees from the Home for the Holidays stamp set onto a scrap piece of white 120-pound weight Simon Says Stamp cardstock. And the ink that I'm using is my black Simon Says Stamp die ink. So to die cut my trees, I'm using the coordinating Holidays at Home craft dies, and I'm positioning the dies around each of the trees and holding them in place using my Scotch Matte removable tape. This is a low-tack tape that keeps them from shifting as I run them through my big shot. So I've placed my die cut trees off to the side, and I've now grabbed this green chevron piece of pattern paper from the Fancy Pants Designs Oh Dear 6x6 paper pad. Now I'm inking up each of the trees again with my Simon Says Stamp black die ink and stamping them onto that pattern paper because I'm going to be paper piecing them on top of the images that I originally stamped. So I'm taking a fine tip pair of scissors and I'm cutting the images out. So here you can see what my cut trees look like. So my next step now is to color the trunks of my trees using my Copic markers, and I'm using E33, 35, and 37. I'm creating an area of shadow on the left side of each of the trunks and then moving towards the lighter area on the right. So I'm starting with my E37, overlapping with my E35, and then finishing off with my E33. And each time I don't go all the way over, I just overlap the previous color I applied slightly. I've now finished coloring both my tree trunks, and my next step now is to piece my pattern paper trees over top of my original stamp trees. So for that, I'm using my liquid adhesive called Tombow Mono Multi-Liquid Glue, applying it to the white cardstock piece and layering my pattern paper piece on top. So my next step now is to give my trees a little bit of depth and dimension, and to do that I'm using my YG91 Copic marker and I'm applying it to each of the sections of my tree. Now I'm applying it along the left hand edge, along the bottom of the section, and then just underneath the section. Now I'm using a very light flicking motion as I'm applying it. I don't want it to be the strokes to be too obvious, so I'm trying not to overlap the strokes too much. The only area that I'm going over a couple times will tend to be in the very little nooks and crannies. So it's now time to create my slopes, and for that I'm using my Simon Says Stamp Stitched Slopes and Hills die. Now for each of the slopes that I'm using, there's two dies. There's the stitched edging, and then there's the actual die that creates the cut. So I started off with a 4x5¼ inch piece of my 120-pound weight cardstock, used my tree to help me determine placement, created my stitch line by running that die through my big shot, then came back and positioned the actual cutting die directly over top, and then ran that through my big shot a second time to get my first slope. I then flipped my cardstock piece, lay my first die cut slope along the bottom for positioning, put my tree back again just for placement, and then took a second one of my slopes. And again, I just started with the actual stitching portion of the die, held it down with my Scotch removable tape to keep it from shifting, ran it through my big shot to create that first stitch line, came back with the actual cut die, positioned it so that the edge was aligned with the stitch slope, and then ran that through my big shot again. And then now you can see I have both my slopes die cut. So here I've taken a 4x5¼ inch piece of my 120-pound Simon Says Stamp white cardstock, an ink applicator tool, and my Simon Says Stamp Sea Glass die ink. And using my ink applicator tool, I'm sponging along the top portion of my cardstock piece. And I'm using a circular motion starting off my cardstock, bringing it onto my cardstock, and just rotating my cardstock as needed. I want it to be darker around the edges and a little bit lighter towards the center of the cardstock piece. So with my cardstock piece sponged, it's now time to stamp my sentiment. And I'm using the Peace on Earth stamp set from Simon Says Stamp, and the sentiment I'm using is the one that says Joy to the World. So I'm stamping it with my Simon Says Stamp black ink in the top right corner of my cardstock piece. So I've created a mask for my sentiment out of masking paper, then applied it directly over top of my stamped sentiment. And that's just to protect it from the embossing paste that I'm going to be applying through my stencil. Now the stencil that I'm using is the Simon Says Stamp 6x6 Falling Stars stencil, and I'm holding it in place over top of my cardstock piece using some painter's tape. Now I'm also covering little bits of the sentiment where some of the stars overlap the masking paper and the cardstock piece itself, and I'm doing that because I don't want partial stars. It looks kind of odd when you remove the stencil. Now here I'm using a small plastic palette knife and very carefully applying a thin layer of my Wendy Vecchi translucent embossing paste over top. Now, as you can see, I'm just picking up little bits of the embossing paste with my plastic palette knife and then very carefully scraping it across my stencil. Now, all the excess I scrape off and then put back into the container. And my stencil I put into a tub of water to keep the embossing paste from hardening on it until I'm ready to clean it. Now, once I removed the stencil, I placed my cardstock piece here, you can see, over top of a coffee filter, and I'm sprinkling on some of my clear sparkle embossing glitter from Wow embossing powder, brushing off any stray flecks using a little paintbrush, and then I use my heat tool to heat it just until the embossing powder melts, and then I let the rest of the embossing paste air dry. So here's what it looks like now that it's dry. Now stamping the little cardinal image from the Home for the Holidays stamp set onto a scrap piece of my 120-pound Simon Says white cardstock using my Simon Says Stamp black dye ink. To color it in, I'm using 3 different Copic markers, R22, 24, and 27. Now for each little segment of my cardinal, I'm starting with my darkest color, which is R27, moving to R24, and then finishing off with R22. Now each time as I apply my marker and then move to the next color, I don't completely overlap the previous color I applied. I just very slightly overlap it. And I use a very gentle kind of flicking or feathering motion. And I go over the areas in that same manner as many times as I need to get a nice smooth blend. So now to die cut my cardinal, I'm placing the coordinating die on top, holding it in place with some low tack tape, and then running it through my Big Shot. So my first step in now assembling my card was to take my second slope, or the top slope, and apply it about 3/8 of an inch up from the bottom of my sponged cardstock piece using my Tombow Mono Multi-Liquid Glue. I then took a strip of my Scotch 3M 3-dimensional foam, cut that strip in half so I had a piece that was about 1/4 inch wide, and then applied my bottom hill over top. Now before sticking my trees down, I just made sure that I positioned them in place so I knew where I wanted them to be. And then the smaller of the trees I applied using my Tombow Mono Multi-Liquid Glue. To give the card a little bit more dimension, I decided to apply the larger of my trees using that leftover strip of the 3M 3-dimensional foam, and then a teeny little square of that foam on the back of my cardinal just to stick it to my tree. So in order to bring a little more red onto the card, I took a piece of baker's twine, I slid it behind the bottom hill, and then brought it around to the front and tied it into a bow. Now the reason I slid it behind the first hill rather than wrapping it all the way around the entire panel is because I didn't want to create any extra dimension or lumps or bumps when I tried to stick that panel onto my card front. So once I had my bow the size that I wanted and the placement I wanted, I just trimmed off the ends and I was ready to apply it to my card front. Now I have here a top folding card 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches, which I created out of my 120-pound weight Simon Says Stamp cardstock. So now my final step for the card was just to take a little glue dot and stick it underneath the center of my bow. And that was simply to keep my bow in place and keep it from flopping around on my card. So that's how I created my Joy to the World card. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video tutorial, and I look forward to stamping with you again. Thanks for watching.